For centuries, the Vikings have been remembered as savage raiders, violent men emerging from the fog with axes raised and blood on their hands. Popular culture paints them as brutal, filthy, and constantly at war. Horned helmets, endless battles, a people driven only by conquest. But history tells a very different story. To understand who the Vikings really were, we must look beyond the myths and follow the evidence, archaeological remains, written records, and the everyday traces of life left behind. What emerges is not a society defined by chaos, but one built on structure, adaptability, and survival. The Vikings were not who you think. The term Viking itself is often misunderstood. It did not describe an entire people or culture. It referred to an activity, going on a raid or expedition. Most Scandinavians during the Viking Age were not raiders at all. They were farmers, fishers, traders, and families whose lives were shaped far more by survival than by violence. Raiding was the exception, not the rule, and carried risks most people could not afford. Daily life revolved around survival in a demanding landscape. Every season required preparation, foresight, and shared labor to endure cold winters and scarce resources. Poor soil and unpredictable weather meant no household could survive alone. Farming, fishing, and storage depended on cooperation and collective effort. Viking communities were small and tightly knit. Trust, mutual obligation, and shared responsibility formed the foundation of everyday life. Violence was not the foundation of their society. Stability was, contrary to popular belief. Vikings did not spend their days fighting. Most of the year was consumed by farming. Crops had to be planted, harvested, stored, and protected. Livestock required constant care. Fishing, hunting, and foraging supplemented diets that varied by region and season. Raiding, when it occurred, was often seasonal and strategic. It was dangerous, uncertain, and far from guaranteed to succeed. Only a fraction of Viking men ever participated regularly in raids. For most, the risks outweighed the rewards. Another enduring myth portrays Vikings as filthy barbarians, indifferent to hygiene. Archaeology tells a very different story. Excavations across Scandinavia reveal combs, tweezers, razors, and ear cleaners, grooming tools carried by both men and women. Written accounts from outside observers, including those who feared the Vikings, frequently comment on their appearance. Vikings bathed regularly, maintained their hair and beards, and cared about how they were perceived. In an era when hygiene standards were generally low across Europe, the Vikings were considered unusually clean. Appearance mattered because reputation mattered. Viking society placed enormous importance on honor, reputation, and trust. A person's word was currency. Agreements were made publicly, witnessed by others, and enforced through social pressure. Law was not absent in Viking communities, it was central. Disputes were settled at assemblies known as things, where free men gathered to debate, judge, and decide outcomes. These meetings followed rules and traditions that limited violence and promoted order. Revenge was not limitless. There were expectations, consequences, and boundaries. This legal culture challenges the idea of Vikings as lawless savages. In reality, they developed systems to manage conflict precisely because unchecked violence threatened survival. Hollywood often shows Viking religion as bloodthirsty and primitive. In truth, Norse belief systems were complex, symbolic, and deeply tied to the natural world. Gods represented forces of chaos and order, fertility and destruction, wisdom and fate. Rituals reinforced community bonds and explained a world that was often cruel and unpredictable. Sacrifice, when it occurred, was rare and heavily symbolic, not the constant carnage depicted in fiction. Even the iconic horned helmet, perhaps the most recognizable Viking symbol, is a complete invention. No archaeological evidence supports its use in battle. Horns would have been impractical, dangerous, and absurd in combat. The image was popularized centuries later by artists and playwrights seeking dramatic flair. The real Viking helmet was functional, simple, protective, and designed for survival. Vikings were also far more connected to the wider world than many realize. They were traders and explorers who established routes stretching from the North Atlantic to the Middle East. Silver coins from Islamic regions have been found in Scandinavian graves. Goods, ideas, and cultures flowed through Viking networks. They founded settlements, not just raiding camps. In many regions, Vikings assimilated, intermarried, and adapted to local customs. They were not a single, unified force, but diverse groups responding to opportunity and pressure. Women in Viking society also defy modern assumptions. While roles were shaped by their time, women held legal rights uncommon in medieval Europe. They could own property, request divorce, manage households, and wield significant social influence. Graves suggest some women held positions of authority and honor. Daily life relied heavily on their labor, skill, and leadership. Viking society could not function without them. So why does the myth of the savage Viking persist? Because it is simpler. Because violence sells. Because stories of chaos are easier to tell than stories of structure. Later chroniclers, often victims of raids, painted Vikings as monsters. Centuries of storytelling amplified those fears. Modern media inherited those exaggerations and turned them into entertainment. But history, when examined closely, reveals something more human. The Vikings were not heroes. They were not villains. They were people shaped by environment, necessity, and belief. They were capable of brutality, yes, but also of cooperation, law, craftsmanship, and resilience. They lived in a world where survival demanded adaptability, where honor mattered because community mattered, where myth explained the unknown and tradition preserved order. Understanding the Vikings means letting go of the caricature and embracing complexity. It means accepting that real history is rarely as dramatic or as simple as the stories we tell. And perhaps that truth is far more interesting than the myth. The Vikings were not the monsters of legend, nor the heroes of myth. They were people shaped by their environment, their beliefs, and the demands of survival. Their world was harsh, but ordered. Violent at times, but governed by law. Capable of destruction, yet built on cooperation and resilience. When we strip away the exaggerations, what remains is not a lesser story of rebellion or glory, but a more human and familiar one. If you enjoyed exploring history beyond the myths, consider subscribing for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching.